Hello, I'm Todd Johnson, and this is Earlylands in Conversation. The world of air travel is unquestionably a modern marvel, yet it is also highly complex and brutally competitive. And now, in this period of skyrocketing fuel prices and global hubs shut down because of the spiraling conflict in the Gulf, the sheer difficulty of running a global airline is in sharp focus. Our guest today is perfectly placed to give us insight into this fascinating world. Allan Kilavuka stepped down earlier this year as Group CEO of Kenya Airways. His 6-year tenure leading the airline through the tumult of COVID, along with a major restructuring effort, provides him unparalleled exposure to the challenges of running a national carrier in a time of global flux. And through it all, Allan met these hurdles with a mix of humor and deep humility. We are pleased to welcome Allan Kilavuka to Earlylands in Conversation. And of course, if you enjoy this and our other episodes, please like and subscribe. Allan, it is wonderful to be with you today. Where are we catching you at?
Thank you, Todd. I am in Nairobi, just taking a bit of a rest.
This is a real pleasure to have you on the podcast. I often tell people, and you've heard me tell the story to my business school students, but you and I think used to share actually a wall at the GE office in South Africa, or a dividing
Right.
wall. So we grew up together in the GE business, and then you took off into an absolutely fascinating, vexing, frustrating business, which is global aviation, right?
That's correct.
And you've always been so kind to come to speak to my students when we're in Nairobi every January. But having someone on the podcast, you're our first aviation themed podcast that we've had here. But having the CEO of one of Africa's largest and longest established carriers. But, your time at Kenya Airways is just such a fascinating period that you were there in particular, let alone all of the unique challenges that come with running an airline. But let's jump into it, because you came to KQ, as they would say. KQ is what Kenya Airways is often known as. So you came to KQ from a background, in GE and technology and consulting. This was not the typical path into airline leadership, right? You did not have a 30-year career at KQ or British Airways or whatever it may be. But tell us, first of all, how you got to KQ. Give us a little
Yeah,
bit of an idea of your journey.
sure. So first of all, it's a pleasure being here, and thank you very much for inviting me to this podcast, Todd. Very nice to talk to you and the listeners. So about my journey into KQ, very, very interesting journey. I actually got called by a headhunter, and the headhunter wanted someone to join a smaller aviation group called Jumbo Jet, which is it's not a legacy carrier. It's a low cost carrier. It's a
Right.
subsidiary of Jumbo Jet of Kenya Airways. And so I struggled with that decision because the argument was that they wanted someone first with international experience. They actually were looking for more a leadership as opposed to an operation person.
Right.
So they wanted someone who can institute proper corporate governance, support them from a leadership point of view, encourage the team, grow the team, think about things strategically as opposed to operationally. And also because I had a lot of experience in growing small businesses, they considered JumboJet a small business or a startup, if you want to call it that.
Right.
And so they thought that I would be the best person. So I struggled with the decision because, like you rightly pointed out, I actually did not have what I considered sufficient experience to run an airline. But they convinced me because, before I joined JumboJet, they did a gap analysis of my personality versus what JumboJet was looking for.
Right.
And they said I was a perfect fit for that particular job. They had been struggling, they had been looking. And so they needed in the next phase of leader because my predecessor in JumboJet, a very, very astute, very experienced aviation guy, had set up the aviation team and was actually retiring. So they were looking for the next phase of leader, someone who would institute, hone in, and grow the organization. So I joined. And
Right.
one of the things I was struggling with before I joined, I remember I asked the question is, would they accept me because I clearly don't have the experience? And the board and even the recruiter told me they would happily accept you because they know what their deficits are. They're aviation
Sure.
people. They don't need you to be an aviation person. And indeed, they embraced me when I joined. They really helped me to learn the business, to grow, to understand the ins and outs of aviation. So I spent a lot of time trying to learn, to hone in, to settle down. And in a few months, I felt like I'd been there the whole time because it's a very dynamic, very busy business.
And so
And
for
so,
the listeners who don't know Swahili, so Jambo, which is hello
yeah,
in Swahili, so Jumbo Jet. Tell us just how many aircraft at the time you took over, and just a sense of its route network, where you were focused in terms of operations.
yeah. So by the time I was joining, they had 5 aircraft, and they were doing just domestic actually.
Right,
So they had just transitioned from two borrowed aircraft from KQ, old aircraft, 737, and they had transitioned into a turboprop, a Q400, which was maybe more easier to maintain and maybe better fit for the business. So they had 5 of those. And so by the time I joined, some of the things that we did was to expand to densify, we call it densify the frequencies to the domestic market, and then go international. So we started flying to Entebbe, we started flying to Kigali, which
right.
is the neighboring countries. And that was so this is one area where I tell people, I mean, it's not all rosy. I mean, I really enjoyed myself at Jumbojet, but that's the one thing that we really failed at. Trying to go international was
Right.
not easy, and we didn't succeed. In fact, I remember Kigali in particular was, at least in the initial stages, was a complete failure.
Hold that thought, because that's going to lead into a further question I have. But before you get into the details of running first Jumbo Jet and then KQ, tell us about your career up until that point, until I guess 2020, right, when you went over to Jumbo Jet, or 2019. But tell us how your career, and then what they saw on your CV that appealed to them.
Yeah, that's, that's another interesting one. So I am actually a trained accountant. So, I started my career with Deloitte here in Nairobi. I spent about 10 years in Deloitte. And and this is going to be relevant when I talk about what they saw in me. Some of the things I did in Deloitte as an accountant was to help new companies that were coming into Nairobi. So particularly South African companies, at that time, around 1995-ish, that's after apartheid. So the South African companies were going international. So one of the things that I kept doing was to help them, understand the Kenyan environment, set up systems. They would be able to start business here in East Africa, actually. So I did that for a bit. I also helped to do a lot of international. I did East African business. So those kinds of things of setting up new businesses and really helping to explain to particularly foreign companies what they needed to understand in a new market helped me get a job in GE. Because
Right,
GE, on the other hand, were planning to start expanding in Africa. So, I joined GE, I helped them to set up across Africa. Then this was an extremely valuable experience for me because, as you know, Africa is a large continent with diverse languages and systems and cultures. I helped GE to set up about 17 offices across Africa, both in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. And then, of course, I joined very many businesses, including, like you mentioned earlier, South African business, helped to revive that business because
right,
it was struggling.
right.
Now, that I did for 14 years. I mean, different roles. As you know, GE is a large company.
You're going to have many different careers in one company, or you could back
Absolutely.
in the days, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the one thing that I really, really appreciate from GE to a large extent is the training I got from a leadership perspective. Forget the practical training, the operational work that I did, but just the training when it comes to leadership, taking initiative, growing, being borderless, how to pitch a good idea, how to strategize, how to get things done. Those were the kind of traits that I think, are very attractive for my next job, which was actually Jumbojet.
Right.
For both Deloitte and GE, this is a very important point actually. For both those two companies, one of the biggest requirements was for you to operate with utmost integrity,
Right.
both in the company and when you're serving your customers, suppliers, and dealing with governments. This is a very, very important trait that actually served me
Right.
well even in the future postings that I had.
Absolutely. And so you went to Jumbo Jet then in 2019, right? And then 2020, you made the transition to KQ. Is that right?
Correct. That's
And so,
correct.
so tell us how, I mean, you went from running a relatively small carrier, Jumbo Jet, with 5 aircraft, small number of domestic Kenyan routes, to sitting as CEO of one of the largest airlines in Africa. How did that transition happen?
Yeah. And actually, maybe I should mention for both those two companies, those two things that I mentioned, integrity and leadership, were some of the two key traits that were attractive to these companies when it came to my posting in those two
And
companies.
all credit to them for recognizing they didn't need an aviation specialist. They needed
Correct.
somebody who brought that GE, this sort of soft skills, so to speak, in terms of
Correct. Correct.
leadership and integrity.
And the argument was simply that we have so many of those people already. We don't need one more. So how was the transition from Jambojet to KQ? So what happened was that KQ at that time were desperate for a CEO, at least in an acting capacity, because their CEO, who was my predecessor, was leaving a little bit earlier than was planned.
Right.
So, they wanted someone to act. And I have to say, I didn't know anybody on the KQ board, but my chairman of Jambojet recommended me to the chairman of KQ without asking me. He just said, I can see you guys are struggling. Why don't you think of Alan? Alan has done a fantastic job in Jambojet. He's grown the routes. He's stabilized the people. He's redeployed people. We have a working system now. I think it would be great for KQ. And so that's when I got the call and said, listen, do you want to act for a bit as we try and recruit for a CEO? I said, actually, I don't. So it took
Right.
another round of convincing, and then I took over the job in
January of 2020. What a time.
January, January of 2020. And the idea was for me to act for 4 months up to April, and then by which time they would have recruited someone. But by March of 2020, even just before COVID kicked in, I got another call from the board saying, listen, you've done such a fantastic job in these 3 months. We don't see any reason why we should recruit externally. I said, well, I mean, everything that I put my hands to, I do well. It doesn't mean I'm the right person for the job. I
Right.
think you should still go ahead and do the recruitment, which they did. They finalized the recruitment. But
Right.
the only thing is that they included my name in there and then say that I still came up tops when it came to the suitability for the role. So they then announced that I was going to take over the substantive role as the CEO. And as it turned out, so I was supposed to start on the 1st of April. And on the 26th of March of 2020, there was an announcement by the Kenyan government that we're going to shut down the airports because of COVID.
So, what's it like to take over an airline that no longer is flying? And yet you have how many employees were you looking after? Who
So at that time, it was 4,000, around about 4,000.
4,000, one of the sort of iconic assets, I guess you would say, in the Kenyan government's sort of
Correct.
stable. And so what was that like, Alan? I mean, that, the challenges that the Emirates and the Deltas and the rest of the world faced. You're
Yes.
facing the same challenges, and you're not an aviation guy outside of your, 1 year experience at Jumbo Jet beforehand.
Yeah. So first of all, it is a fact that the challenge was daunting. That's the truth. I mean,
Oh,
first of
yeah,
all, it was quite overwhelming. But the encouragement I gave myself was, you know what, Alan, go and do your very best. And that's my philosophy in life.
for sure.
Just go and do your best. That's all that is required of you. Put your best foot forward. And actually, if I look through my career, everything that I do to my very best. That's why, I guess that's why the chairman of Jambojet recommended me for this job. So, I mean, although I was overwhelmed by the responsibilities, which was quite a big privilege, but my focus was how can I put my best foot forward. So, obviously did a quick audit of, what was needed, even in January, just before COVID. And I could see there was a problem with the culture, environment. There were some people who were in my opinion, were on the wrong jobs. Some people who basically we needed to refresh, get new
Sure.
people in. So we did a lot of cleaning. And then, of course, the cost structure was wanting. There was a lot of wastage that I needed to deal with.
And I should
And
say,
then,
right, that KQ for the, 7 to 10 years before you took over, I'm not mistaken, had dramatically expanded its fleet and its routes. And so it was in a bit of a cash crunch, correct?
yeah. So actually, what exactly happened was there was a plan to expand significantly, but that particular plan, it was called Project Mawingu. It faltered. It
Right.
didn't work because the capitalization structure was not the right one, and there were also external factors that compromised that expansion plan. So it started, but then failed. So we were struggling with those legacy issues to deal with the lagging cost that came up because of this failed expansion plan. And on top of that, because of the continuous, you said 7 years. At that time, it's a little bit more than 9 years. So
Okay.
just the continuing press to employees, they had had the story about cost cutting many years over and over and over, and they were actually getting very fatigued by this effort. So when are we going to turn around eventually? Now, I have to say that that was in January. So really coming up with a plan, I could see clearly that it was not going to be an easy process. But the three things that I said I was going to do very well is first, I was going to communicate very clearly to all the stakeholders, starting with the employees, because I wanted the employees on the side of this reform or
Right.
transformation process. The second thing I did was that I was not going to relent. In other words, I was going to keep at it. It was going to be a continuous process because it's going to be the long haul. The third thing is that I was going to do my best to change the culture in the organization so that they focus on the key things in life. Just help focus the employees. Because one thing that I recognized and realized that Kenya Airways had fantastic people, experts. In fact, the big airlines that you mentioned were actually doing a lot to try and get them out of Kenya Airways. In fact, if you
Right.
look at the mid-level managers now in those big airlines in the Middle East, many of them are Kenyans. So the
Right.
problem was not about talent. The problem was just how can you provide leadership that directs these resources, these experts, to do the right thing and to move this organization from where it was. So that was my main focus. And then, of course, COVID happened. Yeah. So you have a good plan until COVID hits you on the head and says, okay,
Yeah. The
now
best
deal with it.
laid plans, as they say.
Yeah. Yeah. So when COVID came, we had to, because remember when in January we came up with something we were calling Project Kilimanjaro, which Kilimanjaro basically, for those who don't know, is the second highest mountain in the world. It's the highest peak in Africa. So what we were saying is we would like Kenya Airways to soar to that level. So we
Right.
started with Project Kilimanjaro, but when COVID hit, we were like, okay, let's take a step back. We need to survive. And so we came up with a completely different project. And this project had four elements. One was survival, which we started. Second was stabilization. The third was a recovery. And then fourth was growth.
Right.
And that was going to take place for over a period of 4 years. So I spoke about communication. One of the things I kept telling people is you have to be patient. What we need is time and support because it's not going to turn around in 2 years. It's going to take at least 4 years to turn around.
Right.
And so that's what we rolled out.
Right. I mean, and things such as major salary cutbacks for yourself. Tell us about, we've talked about this before, about food parcels for your employees. You were getting really down at the very nitty-gritty everyday life of your employees, worrying about how they were going to cope.
Correct. So importantly, I mean, you see, like I said, you can have the best made plans until an employee walks into your office and says to you, Alan, you have reduced my salary by 70%. What I am earning cannot pay for food for my children. They have 5 children. So there's no plan for that kind
Right.
of question. So it is those kinds of things that made me to think, I guess we say the cliche outside the box, or to think about a box, in this case, a hamper that would help employees.
Right.
So we really went around speaking to other CEOs. I did speak to CEOs of other companies, and I think I'll call them out because I guess they deserve it. So, CEOs of a company called Bitco. Bitco is fast-moving entities. Unilever, Coca-Cola, Upfield. Those are the key ones. And so the idea was, since you have slow-moving stock and it's COVID, can you spare some of your items that I can give to employees so that it helps
Right.
them? And so they did very generously. They gave me
Right.
hampers, which I was able to give to most of my 4,000 employees. And they truly appreciated the effort that I made to get them to see the next month. And I kept
Absolutely.
telling them, dealing with this kind of crisis is like climbing a mountain, okay? Because I'm a hiker, so I can relate. So it's really one step at a time, one step after another until you get to the peak. You cannot think about the peak because today's challenges cannot be solved by thinking about tomorrow. So you deal with today's challenges, and that's how we handle the crisis going forward. Yeah.
Right. I guess it's the best example of that Churchillian aphorism, right? Of you find yourself in hell, you just keep going.
Correct. Absolutely.
So tell us, so you got to the other end and you helped KQ stay afloat.
Yeah.
And just remind us, the government's stake in KQ is what?
So it's currently 48.9, or let's say
Okay.
49%.
Right. And then your other strategic partners are KLM and Air France, is that right? Or
So the next biggest one is we call them KQ lenders.
okay.
These are local Kenya banks
Right,
uh,
right.
who own about 38%, and then KLM owns about 7.8%.
Gotcha. Okay, there you go. So
Yeah.
tell us. Let's shift to some of the COVID was such an outlier, probably a leadership challenge for the record books, but leading an airline that's operational and booking passengers and flying. We're recording this right now at the same time that most of the carriers in the Middle East and with trickle down effects everywhere are now grounded because of what's happening in the Gulf right now. You have just stepped down from KQ, so you've done it for over 5 years now. It's seriously challenging, right? Give me that line that you've told me before about what it's like to actually run an airline compared to other industries. And then I want to
Yes.
pivot off that.
Yes. So I keep saying, and I've told you before, running an airline, in my estimation, is the most complex business to run, actually, I would say, in the world. And I'm yet to be challenged properly by anybody with regard to that. Why do I say that? Is because everything that can go wrong will and does go wrong in an airline.
Right, of course.
And I'll give you some examples. So very quickly. So one example is the margins are extremely razor thin. So
Right,
of course, it's very easy to wipe out the margins. Secondly, the product that you're offering, which is the seats that you're selling, are very perishable. Once the aircraft takes off, that's it. You cannot resell that seat. It's gone. So it's very highly perishable. And then this business have what we call high capital intensity, and then again, high labor intensity. Most
right,
businesses have either or. They don't have both at the same time. Thirdly, it's that the business is extremely highly regulated. In fact, I don't think there's any, maybe just nuclear industry, but it's very highly regulated for good reasons. So
right,
you have regulations like, for example, if you think about Kenya Airways, you have to abide by not only the Kenya Civil Aviation Authority, you have to abide by all civil aviation authorities that you fly to, which is about 43. On top of that, you have to abide by the restrictions by Sky Team, for example. If you have an alliance like Sky Team, if you have other alliances that you are working with, you have to abide by them. You have to abide by so many restrictions. So it's very, very highly regulated. So those complications, and then it's an everyday thing, very high, very operational. I mean, in Kenya Airways, we had 100 aircraft taking off every day and landing that day. So you have to make sure that those aircraft are taking off on time, every time, so that your passengers get to where they're going as quickly as they can. And then you do
right.
it with a smile.
Right. And you do it with a smile and oftentimes talking to a passenger who is not smiling, right?
Exactly.
I mean, it's sort of, I am an aviation nerd of note. You know this.
Yeah.
Anything that flies, I'm obsessed by. But every time I talk to you, I do recognize that, man, there is a there is a dark side, so to speak, in terms of just the challenge of running any sort of airline. But you've just laid out all those challenges, which are just the operational challenges that come with an airline, plus KQ, but also your other peer national carriers like South African Airways or Air Botswana or Air Namibia, et cetera. You guys face the unbelievable challenge of competing with the likes of Qatar and Etihad and Emirates, which have seemingly endless cash reserves to draw upon. How does a KQ and others like it compete against airlines like Emirates?
Yeah. So if I can contextualize the problem, so I mean, there are many issues, but
Right,
let me say three of them, three big items that African aviation faces. So the first is management. Okay. A lot of the, uh, let's say, airlines have a shortage of managers, either experienced or who have clear strategies to run those airlines. And in any
right,
case, even if they do, there's a lot of interference by the government. So that's one problem. The other problem is undercapitalization. Running an airline is, as I said, is very highly capital intensive. But let
right,
me give you an example. So, for example, One Dreamliner, which is our key. I want to say I mean Kenya Airways, our key wide body.
Right. The
That would
Boeing
cost
78.
Boeing 787, which is about a 300-seater flying from Nairobi to New York directly. That's around about $200 million, a new one.
Right.
Okay. Now it has two engines. One engine will cost you around about $25 million. So that's $50 million. Actually, overhauling those engines will cost you around $15 million each, and you need to do it after so many flight hours, maybe about 10 years after you buy it. So the requirement for cash is constant and heavy. Now,
Right.
if you undercapitalize the airline, what would happen is it will get to a point and it starts stuttering. And you don't have time to respond or react in aviation because, like I said, the product you're offering is very highly perishable. So if you don't have capacity, you lose the opportunity. And then the third thing I would say is there are many external factors. In Africa, as you know, there's a lot of conflict. And then we have what we call an infrastructure deficit. So some of the aerodromes that we fly to are extremely wanting. Sometimes airlines need to dig into their own pockets to show up those deficits in those particular airlines. So African aviation is quite unique in that sense. And so when now you put it up against huge, well-funded, well-oiled machines like those big Middle East carriers, it becomes extremely difficult. What therefore needs to happen is to level up the playing field, okay,
Right.
some level. And I'm not saying babysit these airlines if they're inefficient, but you have to help them to respond, so at least have a fighting chance when it comes to these well-funded airlines that they're competing with.
And are you talking about mergers? Are you talking about a KQ and SAA or the KQ plus all the Southern African small carriers that, again, the Air Namibia, Air Malawi, that sort of thing? What
Yeah.
does it look like? What does the fighting chance against Emirates and Qatar look like?
Okay. So it is, but the first point where we should first start is that African governments need to have one acknowledgement to say, we are making a very deliberate step to make aviation central to our economic blueprint. This is very important because if you look at all successful airlines in the world, including in the US, they make a decision. The government of that particular country decides that they are going to support aviation as a catalyst for economic development in those countries. Now, what we have failed to do in Africa, and this is a general statement because there are some
Right.
African countries which have of course made the right decision, is to say that we want aviation to be a catalyst to support. But instead, what we've done in Africa is that we have penalized aviation because in our minds, we think aviation is for the rich because, of
Right.
course, it's expensive to buy an air ticket. And so what we do instead of facilitating aviation, we tax them out of business. There are heavy taxes, extremely bureaucratic systems, as opposed to supporting and pushing and helping to develop aviation. And those countries, even in Africa, and I'll mention Ethiopia, which has been very deliberate in supporting aviation, you
Right.
can see what the result is. Very successful aviation business.
Right. Ethiopian Airways, which is,
Correct.
quite a bit larger than KQ or any other carrier in Africa.
That's right. And if you go to Asia, think about Singapore, very deliberate steps they take, or
Right.
South Korea. If you go into the Middle East, all those countries, they have made very deliberate effort to say, we are going to support this industry because if we support it, it supports the economy. So that's the one thing. And then what
Right.
you've
So a
just said,
policy environment. So you're saying you've got
policy
to have
environment.
supportive policy from national governments or regional, ECOWAS or the
Correct.
EAC, right?
The Africa Union and
Right.
so
Of
on.
course.
So then you mentioned something very critical, which is really something I hold very dear to me. Aviation needs scale. If you're subscale, you are going to fail unless you have a very niche market. So if you're
Right.
doing safari aviation or you're doing medivac, or you're doing very specialized business. But if you're doing just normal legacy commercial aviation, it has to have scale. Without scale, it can never succeed.
Right.
The main airlines in Africa are subscale. In other words, you don't have enough aircraft and capacity to compete effectively with other people around the world. In fact,
Right.
the rule of the thumb in aviation is if you have less than 50 aircraft, you're subscale. And so there are very few airlines in Africa which have more than 50 aircraft.
How many? What's the fleet now in KQ?
So KQ has around 34.
34. Okay.
Yeah. Now, what is the solution to this? Because like I mentioned earlier, is buying one aircraft is no small change. I mean, it's $200 million. If you have to buy, like in the case of KQ, if you have to buy a 16 aircraft, I mean, that is billions of dollars that you really
Right.
need.
Right.
So, I mean, you take baby steps because there's no even, companies in the US, I mean, in the West and so on, they don't have $2 million sitting around waiting to buy aircraft. But there are different ways of doing it. One of the ways is what you mentioned, which is how about if you do mergers to create scale to begin with? And by the way, this particular strategy is done across the world. It will
Right.
happen in the US during the financial crisis. It happened in Europe several times. In fact, even as we speak today, I see Europe is still consolidating those airspaces so that you have big but more controlled, more strategically aligned airlines or groups of airlines like Lufthansa, KLM Air France. That's one, two, and then IAG, which has
Right.
British Airways and the like. And then, of course, you have small ones, particularly the low cost carriers. But those big legacy carriers come together to create a lot of scale
Right. It's all about
for
consolidation.
correct. So Africa, what we have done tragically is we have gone the opposite direction. Instead of consolidating, we're fragmenting. So that you have, I mean, I was doing a study before I left KQ and I was seeing that the, the, the continent with the largest commercial airlines in the world, you not believe that it is Africa. Not
Right.
and in absolute terms.
Right.
But of course, a lot of those commercial airlines is one or two, but there are a lot.
The
So
largest
what we
number of
need,
commercial airlines for is in Africa.
yes,
Wow.
unbelievably. And Africa has the smallest amount of air traffic in the world. This is about 2%. For such a large continent, this
Right.
continent should
No,
have
no, it's
around,
amazing. Right. Continue your thought because I want to pivot off that, but I don't want to interrupt you. Continue your thought.
yeah. So the thinking is what we need to do with these small little airlines, which, like I said, are never going to succeed because you need scale, is to collapse them into one.
Right.
And we've done it before, actually. It's happened before. In Africa, we used to have something called Air Afrique, which
Right.
was an airline group that covered most of French-speaking Africa. In East Africa, we had East African Airways and so on. So it's possible. We've done it before. So all I'm saying is we need to think about strategically how do we bring this together because it is the only way, in my mind, that we will be able to make aviation more sustainable going forward.
And what's holding that back? Is it a question of political will and policy?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've been around, I've tried to do that. So, what I discovered was because you need to work the political side as well. So,
Of
we did that.
course.
So, the political side kind of understood what we were thinking about and agreed to it. But now, unfortunately, at airline business, it became extremely difficult because what we fail to see, I mean, and in Africa, and I don't blame we as Africans because we have a scarcity issue. So when you think about either a larger or more organized company or airline saying to you, let's merge or let's come together, consolidate, you think about, but they have advantages. Are they going to take advantage of us? As opposed to seeing what the opportunity is for you and them to grow together. So
Right.
this is a mindset issue that we need to change. And I've still not lost hope. It's really, in my mind, this is one of the big things that I'd like to achieve before I eventually retire from,
For
from
sure.
commercial business.
Right. And also, extending from what you were saying, is a lot of African governments want to see their country's name on the tail of an aircraft. They want to be able to have a national carrier, so to speak.
That is so right. But we have a solution for that. I recognize that. We have a solution for that. What we keep telling African government is that we're not going to take away the tail from the aircraft. What we're saying is keep the tail, call it Kenya Airways, call it South African, call it Rwandair, call it whatever you want to call it, but let's have it organized operationally centrally.
Right.
Just like
Like
we have
IAG with British Airways
IAG,
and Iberia and
absolutely. Or even Air France KLM. They
right.
have their SAS, they have Air France KLM, they have other airlines in there. Same thing with AIG, same thing with Lufthansa Group. Everyone has their take,
Right.
but they're organized centrally.
Tell us now that fact you told me about the largest number of actual carriers. It kind of boggles the mind because inter-African connectivity is notoriously poor. It's usually cheaper to fly from Nairobi to London than it is from, say, Nairobi to Lagos or Accra. Why is that?
Yeah. Remember what I said earlier is that actually it boils down to policy. As long as we're treating aviation as a luxury or an elite
Right.
industry,
So we tax
as
it.
long as, yes, as long as we don't think of it as extremely essential to trade and economic development, this is exactly what happens. Because what happens is that many countries around Africa, they levy aviation almost, you feel as if they're almost punishing aviation for doing what they do. So what happens is that they think it's easy money, and then they
Right.
make it extremely difficult for people to move from one country to another. So I'll give you an example. So flying from within Europe, flying from London to, let's say, Paris, you'll pay $13 as a levy. I think it's
Right.
called passenger service charge. Flying from here to Uganda, to Entebbe or to Tanzania, you'll pay 110,
Wow.
almost 10 times more. And this is discouraging traffic. In fact, if I take Entebbe, for example, Entebbe from here to Entebbe, that's about, I would say, 400 kilometers. So it's a
Right.
1 hour flight,
Very quick flight. Right.
very quick flight. And this flight, therefore, I mean, in fact, should be $110 in terms of airfare. But the taxes alone do not allow you to charge that fare.
Right.
And do you know how many buses that are estimated to be leaving Entebbe into Nairobi for trade? We estimate that every night we have between 5 and 8 buses of 60 people driving from Entebbe to Nairobi for an 8 hour journey. Can you imagine if all those people were flying and doing their business
Right. I
and
mean,
pulling the
paying,
trade?
I was just looking at tickets a few days ago for bringing my son home from a gap year, and it was from Milan to Barcelona was something like 27 euros.
Can you imagine?
And it was crazy. And that includes taxes. So it goes back again to this policy question that we talked about here.
Yeah.
And you were just, and that's a great segue, maybe into my second to last question, because I can't believe that 40 minutes has almost run by here, Alan. But you're talking about those hundreds of people who are sitting in uncomfortable buses, riding 8 hours on not great roads from Entebbe to Nairobi. But how do you get Africans who have not had the ability, the financial ability, or just even sense that I can fly? How do you get
Yeah.
them into aircraft and sort of make it much more of the everyman experience that it is in Europe and the United States and elsewhere?
Yeah. So I mean, we're going to chip away at that because we started by there's an attempt that has been made in Africa to have low cost carriers.
Right,
It's a concept that Africans have not quite grasped. I'll give you an example of Jumbo Jet, at least locally. I remember I told you that we failed when we started doing international. In fact, we canceled Entebbe and Kigali, which is very strange because we are trying to introduce cheaper flights, but people are telling you, okay, but how come you're not giving the frills that we are used to? Saying
right.
that's
I want the free couple beers that I have on the flight and the
yeah,
hot
saying that,
meal.
but that's costing you more. We're trying to get
Right,
you to Nairobi in less than an hour for much, much less. So it was difficult to sell this model to Africans because it is new and strange. In Nairobi domestically, JumboJet has done extremely well. It's a very successful airline using this same model.
right,
We did the same. Just to give you a quick illustration. So at some point, when I was there, we decided to literally go to the bus station and say, "Listen, guys, you can actually, they were flying to the western side of Kenya. You can actually use this aircraft, and you'll only spend 40% more, and you'll get there in 45 minutes as opposed to 6 hours."
right,
So we called it fly a bus. So we took a lot of people, put them on an aircraft, and they flew, and that's what supported the growth of Jumbo Jet,
right,
illustrating it physically how to do it. Now we can't do it internationally because there's visa restrictions, there
right.
is passport requirements, and all those things. But locally, I think we've been able to demonstrate the viability of a low cost carrier.
Alan, I hate to do this, but we have to wrap up, my friend. And again, I can talk to somebody about airplanes for hours, as you know, but give us a couple books. We always ask this question, and of course, it could be about aviation in Africa, or it could be inspirational writings. What should be on our nightstand?
Yeah, so there are three books that I would like to recommend. Most of them are leadership books. So one that I've been actually winding up, I've taken long to read it because it's very intense in my opinion. I
Sure.
want to really sink it in. So it's called Dare to Lead by Brene Brown.
Right. Dare to lead. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very, very good book. Excellent book. Then one that I just started reading today called Fooled by Randomness by Nisil Taleb.
Yeah.
This,
Right. Right. Yeah.
and then the last one is it's a classic one. It's High Road Leader. It's a book by John Maxwell.
Right.
And,
High road leader.
yeah, High Road Leader.
Alan, I can't imagine that how you could manage some of the things you've done over the past 6, 7 years without having inspirational leaders on your shoulder, so to speak, whispering in your ear as you manage challenges like COVID. Alan, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope maybe we can have you back because, again, you are stepping down from the position at KQ, but you have plenty of time left. And I think there's going to be another chapter. And I'd love to have you on to talk about whatever that chapter may be, my friend.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.